Hello and welcome to Macro Matters, the economics and politics podcast from Aberdeen Standard Investments. My name is Paul Diggle, Deputy Chief Economist at Aberdeen Standard, and today I'm co-hosting the podcast with Luke Bartholomew, our Senior Economist. Luke's hosted and been a guest on the podcast multiple times before, but today he's joining me in the hosting hot seat. And this week we are talking about new frontiers in central banking. We're going to take a step back from the COVID pandemic and think through recent changes to the US Fed's inflation targeting framework and those of some other central banks, as well as thinking about how central banks are getting involved in climate policy, greening monetary policy, and whether central banks are going to start issuing digital currencies as a response to the rising popularity of cryptocurrencies. So as ever, there is a lot to talk about, and to help us, to guide us through these new frontiers in central banking, we're joined by a very special guest in the form of David Beckworth. David is a senior research fellow at the Mercator Center at George Mason University. He's a former Treasury Department economist. He's now an academic whose research focuses on monetary policy and the banking sector. And he is the host of an excellent podcast, Macro Musings, which Luke and I are both big fans of, would highly recommend it for its great guests and the fascinating conversations David has with them. So David, welcome to the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thank you for having me on board.
Brilliant. So like I said in the introduction, we want to cover three new areas in central banking: policy frameworks, evolving policy frameworks, green monetary policy, and central bank digital currencies. So let's get straight into it with policy frameworks. David, the Fed was the first central bank to rethink its policy framework, at least in this current wave of strategic reviews. What has been your assessment of the average inflation target? I mean, is this a good response to the low inflation, zero lower bound era that we've been in for the past decade or so?
I think that's a great way to kick that off. I think the context is a zero lower bound environment, which has forced them into thinking more seriously about what I call make-up policy. So they're going to make up for past misses in their target, which is really a form of level targeting and price level targeting. We can the details later. But I do think a lot of what we're seeing, monetary policy, fiscal policy, is driven by the environment, the context. And so, yes, this review, this new regime probably would not have happened had we not been in a decade of close to zero lower bound, if not in it altogether. Is it working? Is it in the right direction? I'm a guy who sees the glass half full, so I'll say yes. It's not where I would want to end up, but I do think it's a step in the right direction. And I was surprised that the Fed was the first central bank to do it. You mentioned that fact. Typically, at least I was expecting a smaller central bank, a little more nimble, maybe to try it out. As you guys know, the history of inflation targeting goes back to New Zealand, central bank there, then Australia, the UK. I mean, they tried it first. The Fed kind of steps back and watches and see how it works. But here the Fed's taking the first big step, which was very surprising to me. But I do think it's a step in the right direction, and maybe we can talk more about why, but that's what my overall assessment is.
So yeah, definitely want to get into the sort of the pros and cons of the approach. But before we do that, has it affected monetary policy in the year or so it's been in operation? I mean, has the Fed done things differently in the past 12 months than it would have done had it had its previous 2% inflation target?
I think so. I think the previous framework would have led to interest rate hikes already, or dialing back of the asset purchases, because the previous framework was very much based on a forecast of inflation, forward-looking. Like, we think our model tells us inflation is going to be going up in the next quarter, next month. We need to act now preemptively. Where this framework effectively says, let's wait till we see the white of the eyes of inflation. They're actually going to wait till they actually see 2% sustained over some period that's not well defined. So I do think there's a fundamental difference in that they are taking longer to normalize monetary policy than would be the case otherwise.
And so looking at this from the glass half empty perspective, I know you have some quite strong views, David, as to what you think the optimal policy framework should be a move towards a nominal GDP level target. So do you want to talk about why you think that would be superior and sort of what the differences are between that and where the Fed's landed?
Yeah, so there's a huge literature that goes back at least to the 1980s on nominal GDP level targeting. It can also be called nominal income level targeting, since spending equals total income in the economy. But the reason I think it's a great idea is at the end of the day, financial panics, financial crisis, they're usually avoided if we can stabilize spending and income in the economy. And I mean by income, I don't mean real incomes, but nominal incomes. In the case of the US, dollar-based incomes. And if you look at, for example, what happened in the Great Recession, those countries that by luck or by intention maintained a stable level of nominal income or nominal spending tended to fare better during the Great Recession. So one extreme did relatively well was Australia. They maintained stable nominal GDP growth, and they did much better. At the other extreme, maybe you look at the Eurozone, they did far worse. So total spending in the economy or total income is, to me, it's a way to capture a lot of what central banks are trying to do, but in one variable. It's simpler. There are some issues with it. We can speak about some of the data issues, but to me, it unifies and puts together the dual mandate in one simple measure, nominal GDP or nominal income. And it addresses a whole host of issues: financial stability. It allows the economy to run hot to catch back up to its trend path. It does a lot of, I think, useful things. And I guess go to your question: is average inflation targeting, how is that as compared to what we're doing? What I would like the Fed to do? I would say average inflation targeting is a step in the direction, because it's going to allow the economy to run hot temporarily, which is in turn going to allow incomes to catch back up trend they already have. And under the previous framework, that wouldn't have happened. And we saw that after the Great Recession, 2008 and beyond. It was a very timid response to both fiscal and monetary policy. And just to be clear here, what the Fed is doing, another way of looking at what the Fed is doing is do no harm, kind of like a medical doctor, do no harm when you're dealing with your patient. The Fed is effectively saying, look, we're going to allow fiscal policy, we're going to allow just organic economic growth to take place and not try to stop it, even if inflation is temporarily running high, even if things look a little hot. So that is in very much the spirit of a level target, which ultimately I'd like to be nominal GDP level targeting. And I know in the UK, they talked about that quite a bit too, under Mark Carney and some of the recent leaders there.
Yeah, I mean, to put my cards on the table, I have to say that I'm also extremely sympathetic to these sort of make-up strategies, and perhaps would have liked the Bank of England to have gone a bit further. But maybe to play devil's advocate, a couple of pushback points to see your response to that. So one, with this idea of make-up, is that bygones aren't bygones, right? If you make a mistake in the past, you have to correct it. But I mean, are there not times where actually sometimes you do want bygones to be bygones? For example, we're experiencing this surge of inflation now as the economy, the US economy, various economies open up. Is this really something we want the Fed to be setting policy in 3, 4, 5 years' time, whatever the look back window is, still thinking about? Do we want sort of those bygones to still be playing into Fed policy? And the second sort of, I guess it touches on the bigger rules versus discretion debate. And I think you've had a little bit of interaction on Twitter just recently with Jason Furman around this. This is this idea that actually nominal GDP is pretty close now to target consistent levels, you might think. And a simple reading of that might suggest that, okay, it's time for policy to tighten, but actually it probably isn't time for policy to tighten for various reasons. And so the thought there, I think, is that no one indicator, no one rule really captures the true state of the economy. And the nice thing about the dual mandate might just be that it gives policymakers the discretion to focus on at whatever time the appropriate variable is.
So let me take the second question first, then I'll come to the first one about bygones. So yeah, Jason made a great observation. And you don't need my measure. I have a measure called the nominal GDP gap, which is a little more sophisticated. It's based on forecasts from consensus measures of where the public thought the economy would be in nominal terms. But you could just draw a straight line on nominal GDP and see that we largely returned to that point. So what do we do? What do we do going forward? And if you took a real simple rule that seemed to, look at that, you could interpret this as saying it's time to start tightening. Absolutely. But I would just lay out that there are a number of other versions of this, of a nominal GDP level targeting rule, which wouldn't call for that. I mentioned Gotti Ergetson has a rule that actually would keep it going for a little bit longer. The other thing also just to keep in mind when we think about this, and this gets to one of the other challenges, which I'm surprised you didn't push back on, is the measurement issue, the data issue with nominal GDP targeting. But there's good reason to believe that potential GDP could be growing right now. If productivity growth is going up, if there's innovations, if there's creative destruction going on. I mean, the silver lining in this pandemic is there might be some new investment demand, some new things happening that wasn't happening before. And if that's the case and potential real GDP is going up, then it may be the case that the sustainable level of nominal GDP is higher than we think. And in fact, this measure that I have, which isn't just a simple trend line, it's based on forecasts. I suspect, I've tinkered around, but I suspect in the next few quarters, it's actually going to show us going back below the optimal amount because people have been forecasting higher nominal income growth based on a better outlook of the economy. So yes and no to your second question. It is possible that if you take too rigid a view of the nominal GDP level target, yeah, you could end up in a place not far different than maybe what the previous framework had. But I think, maybe the spirit of Jason's comment, a little flexibility in how you do it would be useful. On bygones, yeah, that's a good question. How far back do you want to go? I think that's what you're asking, right? Like for example, would we want to go back to 2007's nominal GDP level? Because that's like a drop we never made up. And I say no, at some point you need to adjust. At some point, and this is where the art comes in central banking versus the science. Maybe you could say there's some science in there as well. And that's part of the reason I use this forecast approach to looking at the optimal path for nominal GDP. I'm looking at what forecasters, and I use that as a proxy for the public. What did they think? What were they planning on when they took out mortgages, took out leases, when they bought things? What was their expected income path? And it updates. It only allows like a 5-year window, and it's updating over time. And I think you've got to definitely do that. If you were to explicitly adopt a nominal GDP level target, you would have to update the target over time because potential real GDP is changing over time. It could be a gradual adjustment, and there might be some challenges in knowing for sure, how much to adjust. But in theory, you would need to make those changes, I think, in a dynamic setting like we live.
I think those are both excellent points. So I maybe coming at this from a different way, and that is sort of back at your sense of disappointment, maybe that the Fed didn't go far enough with AIT. I mean, perhaps one counter argument to that is, look, the ECB has just done its policy review and frankly was even more disappointing in terms of updating its framework and the kind of things that it would be targeting. So perhaps, there is just this profound institutional conservatism around central banks, and we should be pretty grateful for what we've got. And I raise this point because you've just had this excellent New York Times op-ed come out. And I think part of the argument you make for the reappointment of Powell is, quite what a big deal AIT is and how much political work that took to push through. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit about that op-ed and your case as you see it for Powell's reappointment in this context.
Yes, so I think you're absolutely right. Central banks are very conservative, small c. They are very slow to change. So the fact that this was accomplished at the Fed, a big central bank, is something to take note of. And it required some, smart, savvy, but disarming political skill. And that's one of the points I make in this op-ed, where I make the case that President Biden will likely reappoint him because he needs someone like Jerome Powell. For any kind of change, if you want to keep this movement toward makeup policy moving forward, or any kind of change, we'll talk about the greening of central banks, anything like on those lines, you're going to need a politician as much as you're going to need a monetary theorist at the central bank. You're going to need someone who's smart politically, who stays connected, builds up relationships. And Jay Powell has been exceptionally good at this. He reminds me of Alan Greenspan in many ways. Alan Greenspan was the master of going to cocktail parties in DC, networking. But Jay Powell has gone, he's worn off the carpets of Capitol Hill. That was a phrase he used. I think he's is important because there's a good chance the Republicans take back the House in 2022. And, if you get someone who's very partisan on the progressive side, the Democrats, it's going to add fuel to the fire for the Republicans pushing back. If Jay Powell is up there, I think he is the perfect individual to kind of navigate those murky political waters. It's going to be hard to take this to the finish line, and I hope we get to the finish line, but you need someone with the deft political skills like Jay Powell has shown us.
Great. And David, let's maybe move on to our sort of second new frontier then, which is central bank involvement in climate policy and the greening of monetary policy. And this has been, unlike on inflation targeting and the reviewing the framework, this has been an area where the Fed has maybe been a little bit less active, and perhaps we'll get into reasons why that might be in a minute. But first off, as other central banks, the ECB in particular, raise the importance of climate policy up their agendas. We've seen the Bank of England have a climate mandate added to its list of mandates. I want to ask you how central banks in general balance that growing area of sort of responsibility influence with the primacy of their primary mandates, of their inflation or price level mandates we've been speaking about. How do those two things sort of trade off against each other or work when you've got the primacy of the inflation mandate?
I think it's a very tough juggling act for sure. I think this is going to be potentially creating mission creep at the central banks of the world. So I lay my cards on the table. I do worry this could jeopardize the primacy of the price stability mandates and stabilizing the nominal size of the economy. I understand there's a role to be played by central banks, but even Jay Powell has mentioned the Fed is limited in what it can do, the tools it can do. Now, I know there was a report by the Network for the Greening of the Financial System. They came out with a list of things central banks can do, everything from credit operations, charging different interest rates based on how green you are, your collateral, the assets that you purchase, or you're purchasing green bonds, all those things. So there's things they could do, but I do worry that once we go down this path, and maybe there's a way to do it, and maybe this is why Jay Powell is important. He can kind of thread the needle. But once you head down this path, it opens the door up to all kinds of other, whatever the latest and greatest hot topic is, and this also goes back to another issue, which is tied to how the central banks do monetary policy. Maybe we don't want to get into that, but the Fed and the ECB and most central banks have some version of a floor system. So they have separated the size of their balance sheet from the stance of monetary policy, which means they can expand their balance sheets quite a bit without adjusting rates. And this makes their balance sheets a tempting piggy bank of sorts to fund the green transformation. So I'm kind of answering your question directly. Let me put it this way. Paul Tucker from the UK, well, at the Bank of England, he had this great book out that talked about some of these issues. And a point that he made, that resonated with me, I thought was a good point, is whenever you delegate or whenever you ask an agency like the Federal Reserve, or maybe the EPA, any kind of government agency, and you delegate power to them, how do you also give them legitimacy to implement those policies? And he had this principle that if it's something that there's unanimous consent or a majority of people in the country agree on, then you can delegate that power. So delegate like inflation mandates, price stability. Everyone agrees we don't want to have runaway inflation. Now in Europe, maybe everyone agrees about the climate change, and so you do delegate that on the ECB. In the U.S., that's not the case. There's huge divisions, as you know, politically here in this country, and I worry that we delegate this responsibility to them. It's going to politicize the Fed. That's my concern, is the Fed's going to become increasingly politicized, and it already is to some extent. The push for inequality concerns, all these things are real concerns. I want to be very clear, but I think my own view is that fiscal policy, Congress, Parliament in the UK, they're the ones that should be addressing those issues head on, and at best, central banks can play a supportive role. Otherwise, I do worry about it losing focus of price stability and becoming highly politicized.
So I know that Luke wants to come in on mission creep at central banks, but let me first give the first bit of pushback that perhaps the central banker would give to the case as you presented it there, in which we have heard from Christine Lagarde, from Isabel Schnabel, one of the influential governing council members at the ECB, which is actually a lot of this does fall under the primary inflation targeting mandate, because climate change, transition risks, physical risks have inflationary consequences, and they affect the real side of the economy. So I think they want to make the case this already falls under the mandates. And of course, it has financial stability consequences as well. So where central banks have been tasked with financial stability, I think some of them would want to make the case that actually this isn't mission creep. This is sort of part of the core goal anyway. I wonder what you thought of that argument.
Well, so two things. So you mentioned price stability mandate and financial stability mandate. And yeah, it's true those could indirectly go in through those doors to the central bank. I would just mention this. So inflation over time is the trend inflation rate is probably not going to be affected by climate change. Climate change may have like a one-time increase in prices, maybe multiple things get more scarce, more expensive. It increases the price level. But the sustained inflation rate is driven more by growth in government liabilities and such. So it may have some small role, but I would say that's not very convincing to me, at least. It's not going to make a big difference in the trend inflation rate. Financial stability, I think there's a stronger case there. You do want your system to be robust to shocks. And so I think there's a more convincing case there. But even in that area, I would say the easiest solution to all of our financial stability concerns with regard to banking is simply fund with more capital. Have banks fund with more capital. That will solve climate change, financial stability risk, panics. That's one way to get there. But I do think the financial stability side is probably one where there's more gray area. Look, over time, as we do, the economies are going to green. I think we're on this path no matter what. Just to remain neutral, the Fed will have to buy bonds that are increasingly more and more green. I just think is a function of time and progress on this issue.
So this is going to sound a little bit like a shameless self-plug, but Paul and I have recently just done some work on this topic of greening central banks and wrestling very hard with those issues that you talk about there, Dave. And I have to say, until recently, I think I was probably largely where you're at, very worried about questions of central bank neutrality, not wanting the central bank to be involved in microeconomic questions of allocation, but sticking to sort of ensuring macroeconomic stability and allowing sort of the market or more explicit political forces to do the rest. But sort of where we've ended up landing, and this is a piece that we have coming out on Vox EU, is sort of trying to make the case that actually the existential stakes in climate sort of obviate most of those concerns, that this is just so important that you can hive out the climate issue from other areas where you might worry the central bank would be dragged into once you cross that Rubicon. But I mean, is your thought that that's sort of like hopelessly naive, and once political pressure falls on the central bank to deal with this existential issue, then suddenly people will be talking about, well, actually inequality is existential in its own way, or regional inequalities are existential in their own sort of ways, and so it's far better not to sort of fall to any of those temptations and just keep monetary policy very, very hived off.
Well, that's an interesting argument. So if I understand you, you're saying just like the Fed massively stepped in last year because this was a pandemic, wasn't existential, but it was a very, very, it's like fighting a war, right? We're fighting a war. And so the central bank supports, fiscal policy, supports the treasury. And you're saying the same thing for climate change. We're fighting
exactly.
a war.
War is precisely the analogy. Total war is the analogy. In total war, the central bank is forced to step in and help the government finance or whatever else it might be, and price stability issues are laid to one side.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I hadn't thought of it in that light. I think that adds more weight to it. I guess it's kind of like the U.S. fighting a war in Afghanistan. How long is this war going to last? And it seems like it's going to last a while. I don't know. This war is probably going to be a long, protracted war. I'm not the person who has the definitive answers, obviously, on this, but I hope there's a way to knead this thread where we can maintain price stability, but also address climate change from central banks in a productive manner. I mean, again, I think by default, there's going to be this, just to remain neutral means buying more and more green bonds as the economy turns green. But to go beyond that may be required. And I just want us to be thoughtful and maybe set up guardrails so we don't take this and use it in some other political context. And I do think, though, again, going back to, this is, again, a mechanical operational point, but the operating system of the central banks themselves also feeds into this. It's much easier to have central banks fund whatever your latest political project is if they're doing a floor system, because it separates the stance of policy from the size of the balance sheet.
Great. Yeah, I think we've both, in researching that piece, both Luke and I found Paul Tucker's arguments that you need settled societal consensus to outsource something essentially to an unelected technocratic institution to sort of have political and democratic legitimacy behind that. It needs to already be a settled question, which perhaps explains why you get a different approach in Europe and to some extent the Bank of England than you do from the Fed. Perhaps that's what's going on there. But let's move on then to our third topic, David, which our third on new frontier, central bank digital currencies. So we've done a few episodes on this podcast on CBDCs, as they're called, an increasing number of central banks. I mean, some small European central banks, the Riksbank, the PBOC in China, a host of central banks increasingly researching, thinking about potentially issuing a form of central bank digital currency. It strikes me that, sort of observing from afar, the Fed is slightly less active in some of these questions. It's not done the trials that the PBOC has done, or the sort of the research reports we've seen out of the Bank of England. Do you have any thoughts on why we're seeing sort of less from the US Fed? I mean, is this an issue of exorbitant privilege, meaning the Fed doesn't need to think about these challenges to the dollar as it is at the moment, and it doesn't need to sort of be future gazing to CBDCs just yet?
I think as part of it, and I don't think CBDC is going to fundamentally change who is the dominant currency. But I think maybe a bigger reason is just this U.S. aversion to anything affecting privacy or infringe privacy, as well as infringing on whatever the commercial banking sector is doing. If there's some new form of competition, some new worry that this is going to lead to financial disintermediation from traditional banking, which may not happen under a CBDC. But I think there's just concerns. I guess to summarize, there's probably a lot of, I'm pretty sure this is a big part of it. There's a lot of concern that by doing a CBDC, the Fed's going to be crowding out private sector involvement, private sector activity is what in the privacy issue. I mean, I'm not sure I have an understanding of why China is doing its digital currency, but one thing I think is certain, it certainly helps in monitoring its citizens, right? You can know real time how people are spending, where they're spending, and that's consistent with their vision of government, but that is so far from the vision of Western democracies. And I think in the US in particular, there is a real strong aversion to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, perhaps for the PBOC, the lack of privacy is a feature, not a bug, in a way that it might be for the US. I mean, I think you make an interesting point there about concerns about crowding out the private sector, and I guess there's also this concern that, and again, for some people, this might be a feature, not a bug, that there's not just a crowding out, but quite radical transformation of the financial sector that could occur. People talk about this leading to something like the Chicago Plan and a path to narrow banking. And I guess the first part of my question is, my sense is there is just much less interest in that in the Fed, right, than there might be in other central banks. And the other thing that CBDC is meant to do that might be attractive to some central banks is it makes it easier to administer negative interest rates, right? Once you reduce cash and you have this, particularly if it's CBDC in the form of accounts that the public can hold, it becomes pretty easy to administer negative rates there. And I guess the Fed sort of has tended to stand out as a major central bank that's less interested in using negative rates and more concerned about what they might do to money market funds. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, they've been over backwards for money market funds. I mean, the overnight reverse repo facility is largely servicing all these reserves that the Fed's flooding into the system, and these money market funds aren't able to find a place to earn some kind of return. I mean, the overnight RRP is one way of looking at that. But yes, that I think that's in general the Fed back in 2012, 2011, they're talking about negative rates, and they did not. The worry was we're going to destroy the money market funds, and so I do think there's maybe you could be cynical and say there's lobbying efforts, there's rent seeking, there's political reasons why this hasn't happened. But there's a part of me that finds it very appealing too. And there's a part of me that shares some of these concerns. There's a part of me that says it would be neat to for the Fed to have perfect data on the money supply. I mean, monetarism could be once again a possible way to look at things in the world if the Fed literally controlled the entire money supply, which is in the limit. This wouldn't necessarily take us there, but it could in the limit. But a question I've had is why all the interest right now in CBDCs? Why is it suddenly becoming a big deal? And I don't know if this is the answer, but one thing might be that the advent of like Facebook's Libra, stable coins, the central banks don't want to fall behind, and they're talking about it. And yes, there's different. The U.S. is a little bit slower than some other places, but to me, it's not clear there's a demand for it yet. From the public isn't clamoring, please, Fed, give us a central bank digital currency. Certain policy people are, my good friend Rick Franks, he's been promoting Fed accounts for a long time, and I'm sorry, Morgan Ricks, I said his name incorrectly. He's been looking for Fed accounts for some time, but I just don't see the broad public demand for them. So I think in some ways that the central banks are trying to get out ahead of maybe innovations happening in the private sector.
So one final question from me, at least, just to tie up our conversation back to sort of where we were at the start around the framework review. One other bit of pushback people give is that it's all very well for the central bank to go around announcing new targets for inflation or nominal GDP or whatever else they might be, and informal models maybe changing targets are very powerful. It gets through into expectations very quickly, and that does all the work for you. But in the real world, those changes to targets aren't credible unless there are the tools there to back it up. And perhaps once we're at the effective lower bound and market functioning is pretty smooth, even QE is sort of losing some of its traction, especially as long rates are very low. And if it isn't going to be with central bank digital currency and the capacity to do negative interest rates, or perhaps even helicopter money or funkier stuff around depreciating currency in accounts or whatever it is, like if the Fed isn't going to be getting new tools from this over the long run, does it really have a toolkit that's strong enough to ensure credibility around whatever targets it comes up with?
I think over time tools will emerge, kind of going back to our original talking point, that I think the new frameworks have emerged in this environment, the zero lower bound environment. And I think over time we'll see central banks frustrated. If we stay in the zero lower bound environment, I think you're going to see increasing frustration and call for more tools. Kind of endogenously, we're going to see the Fed, central banks of the world get more and more tools added to their toolkit. So maybe helicopter drops, maybe CBDCs, maybe negative interest rates. But I do think there's going to be some blurring of the lines between monetary policy and fiscal policy. So I think that's inevitable if we stay at the zero lower bound. I've written several pieces on how to do that, how to handle that in a rules-based, systematic manner. So I've argued, again, for nominal GDP level target, above the zero lower bound, it's all interest rates. When you hit the zero lower bound, the Fed kicks in and it does helicopter drops. It gets a fiscal facility, the Treasury Secretary has to sign off on, but it gets a fiscal facility and does helicopter drops until you get back to target. So it's kind of like it's a threshold that kicks in if you hit a certain point, and then you go back to normal if we ever return to normal. So I think there's ways to implement them in a systematic way with guardrails. And I think we will probably end up there if the zero lower bound persists.
Yeah, and monetary fiscal coordination is probably a fourth sort of new frontier we could have added to our list. And I think there'd be a huge amount to talk about there, the tools that opens up. But David, we're about out of time. Thank you so much. It was a fascinating conversation. It's great to have you on. Remember, if you want to hear more from David, check out his podcast, Macro Musings. But thank you for listening to our podcast. Don't forget to like or subscribe on your podcast platform. But until next time, goodbye and good luck out there.
Please note that email is not a secure form of communication, so don't send any personal or sensitive information. This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.